and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham-Pars incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer really standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on podcastufo.com. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And we have a great show tonight. One of my earliest guests that I ever had on my show here, Mack Maloney. And he does a great show called Military X-Files. He's an author, very interesting guy. It should be a great, great show. Alejandro Rojas is coming up in just a minute with the news. And probably some of you are scratching your head. Wasn't Lee Spiegel supposed to be on? I did announce that last week. And, you know, sometimes things come up and people have to reschedule. So nothing's ever set in stone. So Mac was, I was going to ask Mac to be on the show coming up. And so I just asked him if he could be on early. And he said yes. So it worked out just fine. So thank you, all the people who support the show. I appreciate that very much. For those of you who cannot support the show and like to listen to the whole show, of course, you can always go to podcastufo.com every Wednesday at 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Or on our YouTube channel, you can watch us live, actually live stream. And you can subscribe to that channel, and you can also subscribe to our email list on Podcast UFO. And if you also can't watch or listen on Wednesdays, you get an opportunity for Thursdays on the Dark Matter Digital Network, and that's at 10 to midnight. And I'm also on, I've mentioned it, I can't remember the name of it, on Friday nights on Outcast Radio, I think it's called. On Friday nights at 6 p.m. And that's a full show on that as well. So that's it for me. We have some things to talk about. And I have my good friend here, Alejandro Rojas. How are you?
I am doing well. How are you?
Great, great. I guess we both watched that thing going on today. I watched it for a while without audio, and I saw you had a... I'm sure you're going to be talking about that a little bit. Tom DeLonge.
Yeah, it has been Tom DeLonge Day. The first thing, though, I want to talk about before I forget, because this is good news, too, is that documentary, Jeremy Corbell's latest documentary, Patient 17. Yep. It's about alien abduction and the removal, Dr. Roger Leir removing an implant. And this is important just because it's getting so much play. So the distribution's great. It's on iTunes right now. I guess it's going to be on Netflix and some other places. So a lot of distributors are ramping up and showing it. And so it's going to get a lot of exposure to the whole alien implant phenomena, which is a strange one. I mean, to be honest, I'm still kind of out on the fence on this one. Yeah. But if there's anything, this documentary definitely has the most compelling information when it comes to this phenomena. So much so that it convinced Jeremy Corbell that there's something here. So, yeah, that's the first piece of news I wanted to get out there before we get into Tom DeLonge.
Now, didn't I see that Jeremy's movie at the UFO Congress? Didn't we see the whole thing there?
No, actually, it's good you brought that up. That was 20 minutes, so a 20-minute clip. And essentially it was a short that he did. And this new thing is expanding on that by an hour or so. So it's a full-length thing.
I see.
And so there's a lot more in this new piece, which is great because with that 20-minute piece, some people did feel like they were left wanting, a lot more information. And so they're getting it in this full piece.
Yeah. I do remember that was quite compelling about that guy, that he was like a skeptical person to begin with. I believe
exactly.
I remember that. Yeah,
you're right. And that's what's really interesting about this. I guess the guy's even still skeptical that, what Roger Leir removed from his leg even had anything to do with what his abduction experience. But this is not a typical kind of alleged abductee. He's a very grounded person. He's not the type of person. Yeah, if you looked at this guy, and if you knew him, I would feel right off the bat that this is probably someone who thinks all of this is total BS.
Yeah.
But and that's what makes him a really credible person and makes this even more compelling.
Right.
The leg even had anything to do with. So Tom DeLonge, let's get into that, because that's been a crazy couple of days. Even for me, I've been on the phone with DeLonge and his people quite a bit the last couple of days leading up to this, and then in the aftermath. And I think it's really interesting. There's a ton of negativity out there, and in a way that's a bit depressing. Leslie Kane and I were just messaging back and forth with each other about that, and it really, it's one of those moments where it's like, you know what, I don't want to even deal with you, UFO Field. You're just never happy. Just complain, and whine, and that's all we hear. And that's a bit frustrating. Although, on one hand, I can see it a little bit.
It's about expectations. That's what it's all about, I think.
Well, and I agree. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I have a harder time sympathizing with those people, because I come from a more skeptical and kind of cynical perspective. And when we gave him the Researcher of the Year award at the UFO Congress, it was not for what he claims he's going to do in the future. It was for what he had done that year, which was to meet with these very high-level officials and to talk with them about the UFO topic, which opens things up. I think that sort of thing is really important. I'm always skeptical about what may or may not be coming in the future, because you never know what's going to come. And often when we get promises, we're let down. So I guess that's partially why I didn't feel so let down, because I wasn't expecting anything big. And I shouldn't, and maybe I just feel like if you were expecting some sort of big government disclosure, that's just not how the real world works. So, but what's cool about this, and I guess what's got me excited, is that even though Tom DeLonge, of course, he's really into a lot of this stuff, very enthusiastic, he has personal beliefs that a lot of things are going on. The people that he has gathered together in this new company called To the Stars Academy are very, very impressive. I wrote a story about a lot of them. Leslie Kane wrote a very great story on the Huffington Post, and I summarized her story and then added some background and my personal interview with one of these guys, and a little bit of information that I've gotten from Tom. But one of the most exciting people among this group is this guy, Luis Elizondo, and he worked for the Department of Defense on a program to study anomalous aerial threats, or he also calls it unidentified aerial threats. And he essentially says that's what you think it is. That's UFOs. And that he felt that there's something really important. There's something unexplained. He didn't feel... He says if we feel something is unidentified, we call it a threat until we can prove otherwise. But what he discovered is that these things exhibited technology that we don't have while he's working for the DoD looking at this stuff. So this is important because, of course, the government has said that they've been out of the UFO business. Obviously, we know that the evidence has shown otherwise. But this proves it. Here's a guy coming out and saying, look, I looked at these things. They are unidentified. They're mysterious. And essentially he's saying that I don't want to do this behind closed doors anymore with the government because of the bureaucracy. It really doesn't go anywhere. Instead, I want to do this out in the open with a bunch of individuals where we can hopefully develop technologies based off of the technology that we're seeing demonstrated here. So that's a big deal. The other people that are part of this group, Chris Mellon is one of them, who worked for the CIA. He worked for Defense Intelligence. He's had a lot of very high-level jobs. He's retired now. He's actually been in an article. He kind of had a coming out article that Leslie Kane had written about, where he talked about how UFOs are a real thing, and he's very interested in them. In the press conference this morning, he covered a really great case from the Navy, essentially
the
where
Nimitz.
Yeah, the USS Nimitz case where they had seen this, George Knapp is calling it a tic-tac shaped object, an elongated kind of white object, and that these jets had chased it and everything. A great case. And I did post a transcript to the entire event so people can see that at openminds.tv. Mm-hmm. But the guy I talked to who is also very interesting is Jim Semivan, and he has spent 25 years, a whole career in the CIA also. He's worked for the department, the National Clandestine Department. I mean, he's done some very top secret stuff. And what I wanted to know is why. If you're 25 years in the CIA, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And his answers were great. I talked to him actually at length, and he's a really cool guy. Essentially, he's saying that the government, people in the government are much like us. In fact, he's saying a lot of very similar things to what John Alexander says. And people have had experiences. People have talked to their friends. There's a lot of people in government who believe in UFOs and other mysteries. And he's like, I'm one of these people. And we haven't had any ability to really look into any of this stuff in any official capacity. We haven't gone anywhere with it. And that's what he wants to do. He says once he met Tom, and Tom had these similar interests, he said, this is what we need to do. We need to start an organization where we can essentially do like SpaceX. That was their model. SpaceX has gone on to do all of these cool things outside of NASA, and they're already becoming more and more miles ahead of NASA. I mean, if it wasn't for SpaceX, we wouldn't be able to deliver anything to the ISS.
That's right.
We have to rely on SpaceX.
Yep.
So they want to do that. They figured the same thing. If we're going to develop technologies or even understand this phenomena, primarily UFOs, but they also have interests in telepathy and ESP and all of these other things, free energy type devices. If we're going to actually do something along these lines, we're going to have to take this out into the private sector and do this on our own. And that's been his motivation. He says, I'm 65, I'm retired. I've only got 15 years maybe left, and this is what I want to spend the rest of my life doing. And he does make the point that this is not for money for any of them. This is a public benefit company they've created. So you can buy stocks and shares, and you can get involved as an investor. And the public benefit thing is it's a different type of company where you have to spend more of your profits on the company itself. And as part of that, on our story also, you have a link to what's called the offering circular, which tells you all about the company, all the information about the makeup of the company. And in that, you see that these guys aren't really taking salaries, that there's very little when it comes to salaries. It's more about, just getting money to fund these projects. And what they want to do and what they want to rely on people like me and you and others in this community is to find people who are working on research projects, then to fund those projects, to try to discover more about all of what's going on here. It's kind of Bigelow 2.0, but even bigger and better, in that these are more high-level, credible people. Not that Bigelow didn't have that, but these are people with real insight. They're insiders, and they have a lot of access. And it's more public. It's more partially because of the internet, but it's more public interfacing than ever before. So I personally am really excited about this. I think people need to read that transcript, read who these people are and what they're saying, because this group of people coming out and talking about what they're talking about has not happened in this field before like this. So that's a big deal. I'm sorry that, Tom DeLonge didn't have Trump come on stage and say we're being invaded by aliens and we're being abducted and all this crazy other stuff. But what they did say is better because it's not as frightening as all of that. And it gives us hope for this field, I think.
Yeah, besides he tweeted anyway. So,
yeah, true.
Hey, let's address some of the negativity a little bit in here. For instance, in the chat room, someone wrote, having a hard time figuring out why people think DeLonge is doing anything other than making money. I'm sure that's par for some of the typical comments that you were talking about.
I know, but, and with all due respect, it's an ignorant statement. And I know that's strong wording, but it's true. I mean, that means that you have not gone through and read what they're doing or trying to do. Because if you read what they're doing, that you can, like I said, read all about the corporation and where that money is going. You can also, you haven't done your research if that's how you feel. And I think that you need to do that research. And Leslie's provided information, 2 stories, one yesterday, one today. I provided information and the group themselves to the stars. If you go to their website, there's an abundance of information to show that these guys don't need money. Tom DeLonge does not need your money. The way they're going to make money is through other ventures, such as the entertainment industry and the entertainment things that he does. He's going to be channeling that money to this organization. So,
all right. What about some of the other things you've heard that you think are wrongly quoted?
Well, I think that that this has all been done before, or that that's definitely one. That these guys are still employed by the government. That's
How
not
about
the
the
case.
misinformation thing? I've heard that one. That Tom's out there giving misinformation to spread it. He's been given misinformation to muddy up the waters. I'm sure you've heard that one.
I have heard that one. And, to be honest, that one, there are a lot of things that Tom is saying that are not what these other guys are saying. They're not certainly all on the same page. And Tom seems to even have or feels he has insider information that goes beyond and above these people that he's created his company with. And it's entirely possible, I think, though, that he could be getting wrong information, either purposefully or not. He could be getting information from people he trusts who genuinely believe these things and they're just not accurate. Or he could have an inside track on all of us. I don't know. That argument, I could still see why people would be disappointed or frustrated about that, and not maybe qualifying all of those statements that have been made. I certainly could see that. So I guess if you're looking, and I should give those people, if you're looking at the glass half empty type of angle, there's a lot of emptiness there that you can complain about. But on the other side, it is, if you take a step back and look at the net gain here, it is more than we've had before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I tuned into it this morning, and I couldn't get the sound to work for the life of me. And
well, there was a problem with the website. The embed they had there, first of all, it wasn't showing completely.
Right.
And then someone had found out you had to right-click and unmute because some reason it was automatically muted. But
Wow.
Luckily, the live stream on Facebook was really good. And then we posted that on our site, too. And those were working fine. But the site, yeah.
Yeah, that's where I finally got to after communicating with a bunch of people, I finally got to the Facebook site and got to watch it. And then I watched it over afterwards. But, be what it may be to some people. I think it's possibly a move in the right direction. I liked listening to what some of the people said, some of the people you mentioned. Hal Puthoff was interesting. He's always an interesting character. And then also, if you read the website, there are a number of people that are getting involved in this that have great backgrounds. So, it's more along the lines of at least some people in science are taking this more seriously. It's gearing toward that.
Well, I think a lot of us, like Leslie and I, for instance, and some of these others who know some of these people who are involved. For instance, Chris Mellon's part of the UFO data group. Hal Puthoff has been, working on this stuff for quite a while. It's exciting for us because we know these people, that we know that they're credible and their heart's in the right place and that they're the type of people to get stuff done. So I think for those who roll up their sleeves and they're in the muck trying to do stuff on a daily basis and doing research and investigation, those who are professional, and I think that's a really important aspect. Professionals, that this is a good thing because this is another highly professional organization. And I've said for years, we've talked about this, there could be a SETI, there needs to be a SETI of UFOs, a credible scientific group, and I think this could be it. And I think just like for the search for alien life, the SETI's been, SETI has brought that topic to the forefront. And now it's a very credible, serious thing. I think if you have the right organization and the right group of people like we have here, that could be done with the topic that we all care so much about as well.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Well, we ran a little long. You may have some other things to talk about, but we'll probably have to catch up next week.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Hey, thanks so much, and I'll talk to you next week.
All right, talk to you later.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, so our guest is Mack Maloney, and I met him, I think it was 5. Have I been doing this show 5 years? I think going on 6, something like that. Anyway, I met him. He's got that great Boston accent, and I met him in Newburyport, and I did an on-site show with him, and we're sort of neighbors in a way. Mack, how are you?
Good. How are you doing? Fine.
Good.
Good to see you.
Good. Yes. And so you have been doing your military's X-Files now for how long has that been?
Wow. It's been about 3 or 4 years, I guess. 3 or 4 years. Doesn't seem that long, but yeah, we've been doing it for quite a while now.
Yeah. And I've actually listened to some of those shows, and I'll never forget, I have to talk about this, the guy that started screaming and yelling at you. Do you remember who that was?
Which one would that be? I mean, there was a number of them.
There was a guy that pronounced his name wrong, I think. Something like that. Yeah, but he was kind of a lunatic. But I'm telling you, you hung in there with him. And is it ringing bells now? Do you know who I'm talking about?
Well, is it the one? There was one guy who accused me of being a Mossad agent, an agent for Israel, because we were challenging him on 9/11. We've had people who claim to have proof of that the government is dropping stuff on us. That they look at contrails and they think they're chemtrails. We had a big argument over that one night.
Yeah.
So there's many to pick from there.
No, this was a very elderly man, very, very elderly. He was like,
that was our friend from NASA there.
Okay. Yeah.
He's the guy who, we probably shouldn't mention his name on the air, but he's the guy who worked for NASA, and he claimed that he saw an 11-foot alien in the cargo bay of a shuttle.
Yeah.
And
wow.
He kind of went on from there. Yeah, he was an interesting character, that guy.
Yeah, excellent. All right, so you've written books, and I think when we first met, you had just written your first nonfiction UFO book, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what was it? What was the name of that?
It's called UFOs in Wartime. That's right. Just accounts of people seeing lots of UFOs in wartime. Just had this idea, for a long time. It just seemed like I've read all kinds of UFO books, even as a kid. And it just seemed like people were seeing UFOs a lot when there was some kind of a war going on. And so we looked into it a little bit, and it went all the way back to Alexander the Great. And you can go right through all of history. And sure enough, it just seems, I think we make a pretty good case for it, for whatever reason, that people see more UFOs in times of war than during peacetime. Yeah,
and, there's some theories that I have heard about that, and one of them being, time travel, that someone's, going back, trying to find, a certain situation so they can capture it and be an eyewitness to it. Mm-hmm. Was that part of your book, too?
Well, we talked about it, as if these people might be, it might be simply something as time tourists from our future.
Yeah, time tourists, yeah.
Yep, come back to see history being made. There's a few interesting things that kind of go along with that, in that, we have stories of British bombers in the middle of the night bombing some German city in World War II, and all of a sudden, they would see these craft riding right off of their wing, just kind of riding along with them, and just like as if they were observing them. And lots of people saw them. They were called Foo Fighters back then. But there's no evidence at all that any of them ever shot at our planes, shot at anybody. The Germans at the end of the war, the Germans told us being the Allies, we thought they saw them too, and they said, we thought they were your secret weapons, and we said to the Germans, we thought they were your secret weapons. So, but there was no case of them shooting at anybody. I know there was lots of people out there, want to believe that the Nazis had help from aliens and so on, and that, UFOs shot down B-17s and stuff like that. None of that is true. But I think just the fact that these things are kind of benevolent, they're observing, just kind of gives you that idea of, that maybe they just want to see history being made.
Have you ever had the opportunity to actually talk to anyone that's actually seen one of the Foo Fighters when you were doing your research?
Let me think. Good question. No, we talked to people in Sweden about two interesting cases: the ghost flyers of the early 1930s, and then the ghost rockets of 1946. And those guys had talked to people who had seen ghost rockets in 1946. That's the closest I can get to that. But they very detailed accounts of these ghost rockets over Sweden, over all of Scandinavia in 1946, right after World War II ended. And a lot of people thought that they might be German buzz bombs that the Russians somehow got a hold of and were shooting at Sweden for some reason. But they shut down that theory pretty quickly. The United States got involved because Sweden was a neutral country. They asked the British for radar. And two gentlemen, Jimmy Doolittle, who ran the 30 Seconds Over Tokyo raid, and a gentleman named Sarnoff, who went on to create NBC. They were called over there, a secret mission by Truman, to see what was going on. And all the evidence they saw was that these things were not anything that they had ever encountered. They looked more like cruise missiles than anything else. So that's the closest we came to talking to people who had direct contact. We were once removed, but still a fascinating case. Right.
The ghost rockets is another thing that is very intriguing. I've talked to Klaus Svahn from Sweden, real interesting guy. And
we talked to him too. Yeah, he's great. That guy. Yeah.
Oh, he's wonderful. Yeah, and but they're still ongoing. Which is really amazing. There's still ongoing sightings. I think in they saw one crash in a lake like 20 years ago or something like that.
Right. Yeah, they had these. It was that whole thing is really strange because people would see them flying over, as they say, Sweden and other countries in Scandinavia, and they would see them flying in formation, 2 or 3 of them flying in formation, and they were picked up on radar, and they were picked up visually. So it was like one of the first times that you had kind of evidence, electronic evidence that something was up there. But and then there was a Swedish Air Force pilot who rode alongside one for quite a while, and his little drawing description matches a Tomahawk cruise missile, of these days. So it was like one of these things where something seemed, I don't know, caught in the wrong time era or whatever. But as you say, what was very strange, even strange about these things, is that they used to fall into lakes, and then the Swedish Navy would go into the lakes, and they would find no wreckage. They'd have lots of witnesses saying, we saw this thing go in the lake, and by the time they get down there was nothing there. So very strange. Yeah, the ghost flies of 46. They're not quite UFOs, but there's something strange in the sky.
Right. Now, from what I understand, going back to wartime and UFOs, from what I understand, Dr. Richard Haynes was doing some research for Vietnam and
in Korea. Yep, and he was doing the work on Vietnam, and he gave us a lot of information on Korea. Korea's very interesting history in the a very interesting chapter in the history of UFOs.
What about Vietnam? Because I've said a number of times on this show that someone had an insurance agent that I had talked about investigating UFOs in Vietnam. What does he have to say about that? Was there a lot of activity there as well?
Yes, it was. And it's a very strange war because there was just like a lot of different stuff going on there. A lot of drug use. A lot of airplanes and aircraft squeezed into a very small kind of area. as Korea was. But the most interesting story from Vietnam I can think of is the HMS Hobart story. And basically, real quick, people started picking up on American radar, these objects over the DMZ in Vietnam. And people don't know that North Vietnam and South Vietnam at the time were separated by this 30-mile wide demilitarized zone, the DMZ.
Yeah.
And even though the communists had a lot of troops and stuff in there, we were always fighting them in this place that you were supposed to be fighting. But anyway, they started picking up all these flying objects over there, and the communists never really had like helicopters or helicopter gunships and stuff, and that got the U.S. concerned. So they sent a squadron of F-4 Phantoms up to the DMZ, and one night they saw these objects, and they started chasing them. Now, in the meantime, the U.S. military commander over there had asked that any Allied ships in the area, could you please patrol off of the DMZ, because these jets might be chasing out enemy helicopters, is what they called them, out over the Gulf of Tonkin, and you might pick them up as well. So this chase did take place, but the pilots, the American pilots, they weren't chasing helicopters. They were chasing something that looked like a flying saucer, and a number of them. And so the F-4s fired on the flying saucers. They missed them, but they hit this Australian destroyer, the Hobart, and killed 3 sailors, wounded about 30 more. A lot of them had to be airlifted off of the destroyer and brought onto land to be treated by a U.S. Navy burn specialist. A lot of people got burnt. And the U.S. admitted the mistake and, apologized for it. But in the U.S. papers, they didn't mention that these things, might have been chasing UFOs. But in Australia, it was a big, big story. This is in 1968.
Wow.
Big story. And then it never served again and went back to Australia, and they sank it on purpose to be like an unnatural reef,
Yeah.
So, that was a very strange story because just so many people were involved in it, and there were a lot of witnesses. And again, the North Vietnamese did not have like any kind of helicopters or helicopter gunships or any of that stuff in 1968. So, they were chasing the classic UFOs, and it just led to this tragedy on this Australian destroyer.
Now, were you able to pull any like microfilm or anything out of Australia, or is that on websites information?
It might be on websites now. The only thing I saw was the headline. We didn't put it in the book, but it was the headline saying it was the return of the Hobart to Australia. People had been waiting for it to come home, and they they mentioned the UFO aspect, and then like anything else, it died away. But nothing that we could find in American papers had the flying saucer angle.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting. Now, I know you also did a book on Area 51.
Beyond Area 51, yep.
And what beyond Area 51? So what does the title insinuate, actually?
We collected a bunch of stories about places like Area 51 around the world. And we didn't talk about Area 51 at all, but we talked about S4 and St. Louis Valley. And Autech, is it S4 or S2? I can never remember. And Autech down in the Caribbean, and then Nick Redfern helped me with a chapter where we try to figure out where the British Area 51 is. We talk about Area 51s in Russia and in China. So it's really going around the world talking about places like Area 51.
How about that? And I'm sure they're all mostly top secret as Area 51 is, and protected. They're all protected bases.
Yeah. If the point that really came across in this book was, for me, was that a lot of secret bases around the world have UFO histories to them, and you have to think, wow, what came first, the chicken or the egg, But it's just, we can't come up for any reason for it, but it just seems like you pick some secret base like Area 51 or different places in Russia. Kapustin Yar is a place in Russia, which is kind of like a combination Area 51 and Cape Canaveral. and they've had all kinds of UFO sightings over there through the years. And again, do UFOs, are they attracted to secret bases? It just seems like they are. So that for me made the book interesting. Also, a friend of mine who I've known since grade school works for a company that works for the three-letter agencies. And he's on the show a lot. And I was writing this book. Every time I'd finish a couple chapters, I would send it to him just to see if I was getting anything absolutely wrong. Mm-hmm. And so he kind of vetted it for me. And there was a few cases, and we put them right in the book where, he says, nope, you're going in the wrong direction here. But for most part, we were going in the right direction. So, I mean, really, the bottom line is a lot of secret bases around the world. A lot of them have UFO histories attached to them.
Right. And, Area 51 is a mystery. There's, of course, the more the rumors flow with Area 51, probably the more the people that are involved in the security there like it. They probably think, they're probably laughing at some of the stories that come out about Area 51. People seeing alien bodies. That's
sure.
The number one thing.
Right.
It probably actually aids them in a way as far as keeping things secret there, the real things.
There's a base about 70 miles north of Area 51, which is much more secret than Area 51. It's called Tonopah Air Force Base. Huh. And it's near the small town of Tonopah, Nevada, which is almost exactly halfway between Reno and Las Vegas. So if you're a gambling person, if you travel, lots of people who travel between those two cities spend the night in Tonopah, Nevada, but that's about all they do. But about 15 miles outside Tonopah is this base where, for instance, when the stealth fighter first came out, the U.S. Air Force had the stealth fighter for almost 10 years before it was made public. Well, they flew it out of Tonopah. That what they did was they would put, used jet fighters, A-7 jet fighters that used in the Vietnam War. They would put them out on the runway, so Russian spy satellites would see these kind of ordinary A-7s. They put the black boxes from the A-7s into the stealth fighters, and they would fly the stealth fighters around at night. But if you were someone in a control tower, you would think that they were A-7s. They went to this length, to keep the stealth fighter secret. And lots of people from the town worked on this base. You had to have high security. Not one person talked. That was a secret that was kept for 10 years in this country. You couldn't do that these days. But it just shows you how kind of little known this place is. So the stealth fighters moved out of there probably 12 years ago now. And so what are they doing there now? Who knows? Yeah. But that's where really, really secret stuff is. Area 51, to me, it's kind of like the most famous secret base in the world. Everyone knows about it, Yeah. There are other places out in that Nevada desert that much more secret.
And, there's a lot of speculation comes up about the possibility of technology being, we're always 20 years behind on knowing what is out there. Mm-hmm. And what do you think about that statement? Do you think that might be accurate?
I don't, do you mean that we might have captured technology and we're working on it all the time?
No.
Type of thing?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. That we only know about things like 20 years after they're developed.
Yeah, 20 years might be, that might be long. I'm going to say 10 years, easily 10 years. And someone once reminded me when I was researching these books, he says, you got to remember that 9 out of 10 secret projects, especially airplanes, don't go anywhere. They might do one prototype, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. They might crash or whatever happens, and
right. But they learn a little bit from that, and they put it into the next one. They learn a little bit from that, and the next thing you have like something like the B-2 stealth bomber, right? People out there, out in that area, they see strange stuff in the skies all the time out there. A lot of them are these, prototypes that, as you say, they might fly once and crash. Who knows? But people see them. They look strange to them. And I think that leads to a lot of UFO sightings. You're really looking at stuff that looks very strange. You'll never see it again. The forerunner to the stealth fighter was this thing called Pave Blue. and all you could the best way you could describe this thing was it looks like a flying whale with wings on it. It's just very, very strange looking thing, and they would just it was a shape that they were testing to see what the best stealth shape would be. But if you ever saw this thing in the air, it looks like it looks like a spaceship from the 1950s movie. People saw that. What else would they think it was? Mm-hmm. So a lot of strange stuff flies around out there, but a lot of it isn't necessarily UFOs. And 10 years, I think 10 to 12 years is probably a good, a time frame. They just came up with the SR-72, which is going to take the SR-71 Blackbird's place, spy plane. And, everyone knows they've been working on that for at least a dozen years.
Yeah, right. Mike in the chat says, thank you for writing your books. Now, how many other books? You have just a couple books on UFOs, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. 2. Yep.
Yeah. Uh-huh. And anything in the works, possibly? Have you been thinking about it?
UFO books, no. I've gone back to writing fiction books because they're a lot easier to do. You don't have to do all the research and stuff, I mean.
So true. Yeah.
Yeah. I probably said this before on the previous show, but halfway through UFOs in Wartime, I just looked around my office and it's just like piles of research and stuff has to be fact checked and stuff.
Yeah.
I said, wow, what did I get myself into? Yeah, this is a lot of work. But I'm glad I did it, and people liked it. But whether I do another one, boy, it would take me a while to kind of think about that, I think.
I just thought of something early on in me doing this show. You told me, you said, hey, look, if you're thinking about making money, forget it. UFO field.
In the publishing business, yeah.
No, as far as UFOs go.
Oh, I see.
And I said, no, I'm not. I'm doing this because I find it really interesting. But I do remember you're saying that, plus the people that have to put the research, like, I think of someone like John Alexander, for instance. Mm-hmm. He, really, really, you can fact check all his footnotes. I mean, they're really solid. And yeah. So I mean, and there's other books like that too. He
used to come on our show, but he doesn't like me for some reason. I don't know why. Oh, well. I mean, I really don't know why. We had a lot of, he used to come on a show I was on kind of regularly, and we used to talk to him all the time. And then all of a sudden, I was persona non grata for some reason.
How about that? Now, how you have your show one time a week, right? Is it one day a week? Yeah.
Yep.
And you've been going for at least 3 years, and you have actually gone out into other topics as well, all different types of topics.
Yeah, right. It's like, we get together, myself and I have 2 co-hosts, a guy named Juan and a guy named Commander Cobra. And
I
they're
remember
both
Cobra.
veterans.
Yeah.
Cobra works for, he's was in the military for 20 years, pilot, helicopter pilot, and fixed-wing aircraft pilot. And now he works for a military contractor. And there's some nights he isn't in the studio with us because he's doing jobs that he can't tell us where he is. And I know you hear that kind of stuff kind of thrown around a lot, but I mean, legitimately, he cannot tell us where he is because he's on some kind of mission that's been contracted out to his company by the government. So, but when we get together, we do a lot of things. We do we talk about the relationships of some of our correspondents. One guy just broke up with his girlfriend, so we're trying to help him, hook up again. And we talked to Travis Walton yesterday.
Oh,
we went to a UFO conference in Leominster this weekend, and we happened to call. We wanted to get one of the organizers on, and she was driving Travis Walton to Logan Airport, and we got him to tell us that he's been around the circuit enough that, because of his celebrity status, he gets to meet a lot of girls, There you go, So, getting captured, getting abducted by aliens does have its good points, it seems. And he told us that, we're going to have him on and talk a lot about it for about an hour sometime. So, it's someone said once and I hate to use this, but they said if Howard Stern had a UFO show, it'd be like this. And it's not quite as crazy, but we do some pretty nutty stuff.
Yeah, you have fun, which is really important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. So let's talk a little bit about, I mentioned to you ahead of the show, we should cover a little bit about UFO stories in New England, since we're both sitting in New England right here now. And so Massachusetts, the state where you're out in Plum Island. So Massachusetts, there have been a lot of very interesting sightings there. There's any in particular that you really paid attention to, when it was happening?
Years ago, when I worked for the local newspaper up here, they had like a flap up here near Salisbury Beach where people were seeing these UFOs, very detailed UFOs. I'm talking about maybe early 80s. And they came down over the marshes. This is the next town over from Newburyport. And what really struck me about them was that they would describe these things in such detail, and then they just went away. Lots of people saw them, but were they picked up on radar, things like that? I don't think so. The Exeter, New Hampshire one is one of my favorite ones. That's a really crazy one. We were just talking about that the other night, and boy, the stuff that went on in the Exeter incident, they call it, is just really something else. There's the Bridgewater Triangle is very interesting. People I know live down there. They go to school down there, and they go into that place, and a lot of really odd stuff happens down there too. So there's been a number of UFO sightings in Leominster, Mass, as it turns out, where we just were. New Hampshire, Massachusetts have a lot of sightings. I think Michigan, next to California, Michigan is the second largest. It is the second state with the largest UFO cases reported, but New Hampshire and New England has to be right up there.
Yeah, a listener contacted me a while ago and said, "Hey, the state of Maine, actually has quite a few sightings, but I know there are some charts that show, sightings per state and, that are reported per state. But as I'm sure there's probably many more sightings that are not reported that are seen. There's a very small percentage of sightings that were actually reported.
Right. Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it takes a lot for a person these days to report a UFO. I think that whole kind of crazy factor that the CIA introduced in the early 50s, where they actually, bought news stories to spread around the country, making fun of people who saw flying saucers, when at the same time they were testing their own spy planes, flying them over major cities, and then checking the next day to see how many people reported seeing UFOs, because it gave them data on how high you can fly these things before you're not seen and how fast you can go and stuff like that. So that whole ridicule factor that they entered into, kind of like into our DNA back in the 50s, still holds today, I mean, I've never seen a UFO. If I saw one, I think I would report it. There are, you can go onto websites where, even in Massachusetts alone, someone sent this to me, and there are like probably a half a dozen really good sightings in Massachusetts every week. But I just think it takes a lot for people to say, okay, I'm definitely going to report this, especially if you're an airline pilot or a military pilot. Then you're never going to report it.
Right.
So I'm sure thousands and thousands go unreported. Yeah,
I know my sighting that I had, I didn't report it. I didn't know really how to report it. I called the police department. I didn't know who to call.
Yeah, right.
It never once occurred to me for a second that I could do something online. I never even thought that way. And that may be the same way now.
I'll tell you a quick story. I've never seen a UFO, but a few years ago, we were here on Plum Island. Down the southern end of it is a federal reservation. And we were down there at dusk, my wife and I, and we were on this boardwalk. We were looking at these huge waves that were coming in after a hurricane, and we looked over these marshes that stretched to Ipswich, as you would know the area, right? And we see these two clusters of blinking lights coming right at us, different colors, blinking, crazy, chaotic, but coming right at us. And I just said to her, I says, wow, this is it. We're going to see a UFO. There was nothing this could have been. Flying low and very fast. And they went over us, and there were two medevac helicopters following each other. Wow. And they were like flying ambulances, Mm-hmm. And I could have sworn I would have bet $1,000 that these were going to be UFOs, and they weren't. So it just proves people see a lot of things every day, and they're not UFOs, drones. We have a woman on, Cindy Bailey Dove, who does a drone report every few weeks. And she's just proven to us by the number of times she's been on that, the U.S. government has been flying drones since the late 40s, all during the 50s. You just didn't hear about it. But, I hate to say it, but a lot of UFO sightings from the 50s on, a lot of them had to be drones, and they're not, they're not from outer space. So there's a lot of stuff flying around up there, and you just got to, make sure that when you see something that is really something out of the ordinary, then you report it.
Right. And, one of the things, talking about reporting, one of the things that's very important that I've brought up a couple of times is for you to immediately stop whatever, you were going to be doing and write everything down because, memory is fallible. And
right.
Also, if you have other witnesses, you want them to write something down too. You compare notes after.
Right.
But yeah, I think only the people that would be like listening to a show like this would know to do something like that. Other than that, they wouldn't know. Normally, no one would know exactly what to do after a sighting.
Right. I'm sure a lot of people call the police.
Yeah.
But what are they going to do? But a lot of times that they call especially if you're in a small town, and if there's a cop who can actually look into it. Many times they see the same thing. They see the UFO. Yeah, it's strange, and I think a lot of it too has to do with whether you live near a military base or not, because there's a lot of activity up here in the southern part of New Hampshire, and Pease Air Force Base has been up there for years. And these sightings just seem to cluster around Air Force bases. Then so people say, well, what you're seeing are the airplanes. But they say, no, because if you live near an Air Force base, you know what an airplane looks like coming in. You know what a F-16 looks like or a KC-135 tank. You know what they look like. You're almost an expert in it. And when you see something that doesn't look like one of those things, then you are a really good witness. And a lot of people see strange things around you.
I grew up with a bird's eye view, a perfect view of Pease Air Force Base. Mm-hmm. I lived in Elliott, Maine. I was on top of a hill called Winter Hill. We had grew up at a really nice house on top of a hill overlooking the river. Across the river was Pease Air Force Base. And my sisters and I used to sit on the front lawn and just watch what was going on over there.
Yeah.
And we saw weather balloons. We saw all kinds of really odd things. Matter of fact, we thought we were seeing a UFO when I was a little kid, but it was just a weather balloon. But it was really weird because it was going up and down. And I remember it had an orange stripe on it. And, just this white ball with an orange stripe going up and down,
That was a SAC base for a while, Strategic Air Command Base.
Yeah.
And we were talking to someone the other day who told us this story. They were up there on a tour for some contractor, and they got a call. Pease Air Force Base got a call saying you have to clear, your largest runway for it. And they have the place is enormous, and they do have these
10,000-foot runway.
Right, and I think the shuttle, it was like an emergency place for the shuttle to land. That's how long this runway is. So they said, you have to clear this runway for us. We're aircraft and we're having mechanical issues. And they said, well, where are you? And they said, we just left UK airspace, but we'll be there in about 35 minutes, and we have to land. And it was the SR-71.
Oh.
The Blackbird. And one of them landed, and one of its engines there was something wrong with it. They just wheeled it into a hangar. They worked on it for 5 days, got it working, and then in the dead of night had to take off again.
Wow.
Now, if you didn't know what an SR-71 Blackbird looked like, you saw one of these things in the sky, you would swear it was, something from Star Trek or something, So again, people see a lot of strange things. Who knows what, half of them are.
Right. I was actually at an auction gallery in Amesbury, Massachusetts. A friend of mine owns, and the woman that worked in the gallery was looking up something about me on the internet, and she goes, "You do a show on UFOs?" And then she said, "I had a sighting in local, in Massachusetts, of a triangle." She said she was really young. She got out of the car. It hovered over the car. Her aunt was driving, and they saw it. And so this was And she said it was reported in the paper the next day. Now, that was back, I don't know if you remember that. There was triangle sightings in Massachusetts way back when, I think in the early 80s or late 70s.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of activity like that out in the western part of the state as well. At this conference we were at this weekend, the Greater New England UFO Conference, which was really, really good in Leominster, Mass.
Yeah. One
of the speakers told the story about how when he was a kid, he was driving around in the area out there, and they came to this intersection, and it was mother, father, and 3 kids in the back, and the father stopped at a red light, and then he pulled the car over, and he got out of the car and started looking at something up in the sky, and the kids tried to get out, and this guy, he was like, he's an adult now, but he was like about 6 years old, and he said, all I can remember is my father pushed me back into the car. But of course, that made him want to see what it was even more. And they looked up, and there was a triangle-shaped object hovering right above this intersection really late at night. Scared the kids, scared the whole family. But he said it really left an impression on me because my father didn't want me to see it, So he just thinks that it was just, something he shouldn't have seen or whatever. But he saw it, and there's a triangle-shaped object just hovering there. You hear about them a lot in this area.
Yeah. I have a friend in, I don't know where he was then, but in Massachusetts. But, he had a sighting with his friends, and this was a weird sighting because it was a negative sighting. Like, they all felt really upset, kind of like what you were talking about a little bit. The father didn't want the son to see it. But they never talked about it, which I think is, they kept their heads down after they saw it, and just walked home and didn't talk about it.
I have an older brother who was in the Air Force for 22 years, and he actually went to Area 51 a couple times to work on jet airplanes that had needed engine repair there. But he was serving at Nellis Air Force Base, which is right outside of Las Vegas. And he told me when he first went in the service, he was down in Charleston, South Carolina, working on F-4 Phantoms, and they used to do it at night because it was cooler than doing it during the summer down there. And he said one night this object just came down, right down on top of them. And it was like 10 feet off the top of this jet that they were working on. And he said it startled us, so we all jumped underneath the jet. And we just lay in there, and he says, I can just see the light still on the tarmac, and it was really crazy. And then the thing took off. And he said the biggest mistake I made was we actually reported this to the higher-ups, and they were immediately, there were 4 of them, they were immediately put into 4 separate rooms, and, someone in civilian clothes would just come in, and they would just ask them over and over again, okay, let's go over the story again. You saw this, you saw that, this happened, so on, and then they'd say, well, your friend said it was this, and just almost like a interrogation in some kind of a murder trial or something. And finally, my brother he says after 4 days, I just realized, what they were trying to get us to do. And basically what they wound up doing was signing a statement saying that they saw a reentry vehicle from Cape Canaveral, which makes no sense at all. But he just wanted to get out of it. They just wore them down. Until it was, and made it clear to them that you're not going to get out of here until, you basically, see our line of thinking. Now, it would be a better story if you knew my brother. He's completely different from what I am. He's just very conservative, doesn't believe in conspiracies or anything like that. He's just, one of these people whose feet are solid on the ground. He told me that story once, would never tell me the story again. And something happened to him, something happened to him. And I think it's happened to a lot of vets. Yeah. I think a lot of veterans have seen stuff, and they've gone through a situation like that, or people say to them, don't talk about this or you lose your pension or whatever. We have we have a thing we call for the amnesty for any veteran who was told during his service career, don't talk about a UFO or you'll lose your pension or, whatever. We think there should be a blanket amnesty for all those people. Just think of how many stories would come out, how much more research we would be able to do if these guys could come out and talk about it without fear of being, some kind of retaliation by the military. And if we could ever get as far as the Pentagon to ask them to do something like this, it would be interesting, because if they did it, it would be great, because I think there'd be a tidal wave of news stories, stuff we have never heard of before. And if they said no, then, there's more proof that they're hiding something.
You know,
so I think that would be really good.
I do too, and that's very similar to what I've heard someone say about airline pilots. You know, if airline pilots could speak freely about, you know, sightings, how many more would you hear of?
Right.
You know, quite a few.
Right. And Dr. Richard Haynes, who we talked about earlier, he worked for NASA, and he was one of the guys who put the Gemini capsule together. So this guy, you know, knows what he's talking about. And he told me that after 9/11, the number of sightings by military pilots went through the roof. Not that UFOs had anything to do with 9/11, but what we had more jets up there flying around. We had more opportunities for these pilots to make sightings, which kind of goes back to the UFOs in wartime thing. Is more UFOs spotted because we have more airplanes in the air because it's war. You know, I mean, we never really we give you the stories, but we can never really figure out what the conclusion is. But this is kind of the same thing: more military planes in the air, more UFO sightings. Just interesting,
right? You were talking just a minute ago about the interrogations, and that kind of reminds me of the Rendlesham Forest case, because they were heavily interrogated for, I think, 3 days, if I might have that wrong, but something like 3 days, you know, and then supposedly drugged, which is really bizarre.
Well, that story, you know, kind of goes off the rails a little bit. You know, the deeper you get into it, we saw Peter Robbins this weekend, and he is someone who's been talking about the Rendlesham Forest incident for years. I mean, obviously something happened. They have a tape recording of the people in the forest looking at this thing, and you know, it was made by a major, a lieutenant colonel, someone who is, you know, is not in the game to hoax these things. In fact, his quote was, I think his name is Major Halt.
Yeah, Charles.
He said, Charles Halt. He said, I'm the guy who debunks this kind of stuff, you know, and he actually made a recording of people seeing one of these things. You know, one of the little known facts, or maybe it was little known to me till, well, I found it out, was there was an NSA listening station only about 2 or 3 miles from those bases. And also there's, in that part of England, the East Anglia part of England, there's lots of UFO, there's a long UFO history in that part of England. So what went on there, I don't know, but you're right. They were, same thing as my brother's experience. They kind of separated them and took their stories and tried to trip them up and finally just wore them down to, you know, who knows what.
Yeah. During the news, Alejandro Rojas was brought up, Christopher Mellon, Chris Mellon, a few different times, and he was on this show. I was the first person to interview him, and George Knapp interviewed him. I actually set that up for George to interview him. But so he doesn't do a lot of interviews, but if you do catch the video of him with Tom DeLonge today, he talks about the USS Nimitz and that sighting. And I had never heard that story before, and what an incredible story that is. I don't know if you've ever heard anything about it, but it is. So, again, that's it. Another show. Thank you so much for listening. This is the free part of the show, of course. If you want to listen to the full 2-hour show, all you have to do is sign up on our website, podcastufo.com, for as little as $2 a month or more. And you can also sign up for a yearly fee, so you don't have to have it deducted monthly out of your account. That way you get to play all the shows on a media player on our website, and also the archives, as well as the Everything Else show. Thanks so much for listening. And again, there are ways to check out the whole show for free. The Dark Matter Digital Network, of course, on Thursday nights from 12 to midnight. And next week, our guests, there are 2 of them, Randy Nickerson on the Ariel School film he is producing, and a eyewitness at the time, Salon Siddiq, and I hope I pronounced that name right. So we'll be back next week, as always, and remember to keep your eyes to the sky.